Thank you very much for inviting me here. Let me just begin by saying, I was just telling my friend here that I grew up in Kolkata, which Vijay Prasad once told me was this heaven of free thinking, pure, pristine air, breathing from every pore and soaking into our lungs and so on and so forth. And he, of course, accused me of being an imperial stooge because I work for a company called Fortune India. Um, but I actually grew up in those pristine air of Calcutta under communist rule, where my father was almost murdered because he was too poor to pay. In Bengal you have to pay chanda. Hafta you have to pay. You have to pay the party cadre hafta to survive there. My father was unfortunately an honest government officer. I didn't have money. His parents died of cancer and couldn't pay one season and almost got knifed on the streets of Calcutta and almost died there. Thankfully, was rescued by my uncles and so on and so forth. So it is a rare and complete honor for me to even stand here in the hallowed portals of JNU to even be talking about something like Make in India and the East Asian marvel. And good or bad, I mean, I want to congratulate and thank India First for this wonderful attempt that you were able to discuss it here in JNU. To me is a great honor, and thank you very much for having me here. Having said that, let me take off from what Sir was saying. He made a very interesting point about how Calcutta was never made into a hub. I've just written a new book where I argue that the problem with Calcutta and us Bengalis is that we remembered the right Tagore, but we also forgot the right Tagore. What do I mean by that, right? I argue that we remembered Rabindranath, which was fantastic, right? And he was a great humanitarian. But we forgot his ancestor. We forgot Dwarkanath Tagore. We forgot Prince Dwarkanath Tagore. We forgot the man who tried to bring in the Industrial Revolution to Bengal. The man who fought his whole life in that state to bring that revolution. I mean, just imagine for a moment, go back in history and imagine if Dwarkanath Tagore had been able to truly bring the Industrial Revolution to Bengal, what would Bengal be today? So we remembered the wrong Tagore, right? Make in India. But before I go into Make in India, let me sort of quickly address this East Asian thing, right? People forget what the East Asian marvel was all about. The East Asian marvel was not just about foreign direct investment. I hear, and let me now address the other side because I spoke about the communists also. I hear the hard right sort of constantly argue that supposedly Walmart will change our lives. We will bring in Walmart and everything will get solved. I disagree. I don't think that alone will solve it, because if you really understand the East Asian marvel, you will realize that the East Asian marvel is also based so much on what we call a virtuous cycle in economics, right? It's based on strong savings, it's based on banks working efficiently, because remember, the Asian crisis in part was created by banks not being able to or not having the correct wherewithal to allow the right kind of investment and to flow the domestic savings into the right kind of sectors, and that entire chain sort of broke down, right? So it's not just about foreign direct investment, it's much more than that. It's about how we, create an idea. One of my economics professors used to say that economics is first in the mind, right? If before it happens on the ground, it must happen first in the mind. And let me tell you a story about that. Economics has got a bad name. I've been abused for being a business journalism and imperial stooge for the last 12 years of my life. Even though unlike Vijay Prasad, I make, my aunt is not Brinda Karat and my father's nobody, and I make the money that I make because of who I am and what I studied. But be that as it may, let me say this, that everybody thinks of economics as something that's inherently not Indian, right? And something that brings no benefit apart from to some very large companies whose owners build $1 billion homes in the middle of Bombay and so on and so forth, right? In the new book that I wrote, I found this extremely interesting example of a man called Bhimji Parekh. You should look up these two characters, Veerji Shah and Bhimji Parekh. Bhimji Parekh is a very interesting man. Bhimji Parekh is a trader essentially, based at that time in the Bombay area, so to speak, in Surat. And Bhimji Parekh actually leads, as a capitalist, the first ever trader strike in India against against the regional sort of satrap of Aurangzeb, because their temples are being destroyed, and they're not being given the freedom that they want. So he actually leads a strike of 600 merchants away from Surat to Bombay, saying we will not conduct business until you give us the freedom. Now, why am I telling you this story? Because I believe that essentially, as my economics professor used to argue, that the idea of make in India or made in India or anything to do with economics really first has to begin in the mind. It has to begin as an idea first before we actually apply it on the ground. This virtuous cycle that we were talking about as the East Asian model, it will never happen unless we first imagine it to happen, right? Now, it's very interesting that you all have invited me this year to speak at JNU, because as it so happens, and because we're talking about trade, this is the 1000th anniversary of the coronation of a man called Rajendra I of the Chola Dynasty. Now, if you read about the Chola Dynasty, you will realize the Cholas were one of the first great maritime powers, trade powers of India. And they did great things, right? And I made some notes to speak about here before I came. Remember, the Cholas, and before the Cholas, India is already trading with the Roman Empire, right? I mean, it's already in 75 Common Era that Pliny the Elder is writing with great frustration that in no year does India not drain away at least 55 million gold sesterces from the Empire of Rome. Why does India do that? Because India then makes some of the greatest things that Rome wants. And what are some of those things? There is a caste which we talk about in economic history called the Sully caste. The textile manufacturers of India, right? And if you read some of the great Tamil epics, there is mention about fabric which is like invisible weave, which is as thin as the skin of a snake, fabric which is as fine as vapor, and which is rising from milk. Fabric which is so fine that it seems like vapor rising from milk, and fabric which is the perfumed cloth. By the way, perfumed cloth, we at Fortune researched and found, even today in Bengal, that the one last family has that expertise, which they are able to create fabric out of cotton and quilts out of cotton, which are actually perfumed. It's of course not marketed, nobody knows, they live in poverty and so on and so forth. But we in Fortune were doing some research in Bengal, and we found out that there is this one last family which does that, and the guy is probably 75 years old or something, and he'll die, and that will be the end of it. But let's come back to the Cholas. The Cholas are very interesting because the Cholas, if you read the history of the Cholas, they recognize that at that time in maritime trade in our part of the world, China is the superpower, right? I mean, there's no dispute about that China rocks, so to speak. China is the power. But they build they build consistent, active relations with the whole of East Asia. And at that time, of course, remember, Hinduism is spreading. So, you look at the entire Malay belt, you look at Indonesia, you look at Sumatra, you look at Java, you look at how, Hinduism is spreading and spreading on the back of trade, spreading on the back of the great Tamil, clans of trade. There is this mention of the 500, the 500 Tamil traders, the Nanadisis, as they call them in Sri Lanka, who are some of the first people who, when Raja I and his son Rajendra I conquer Sri Lanka and are not able to, in fact, that's actually a bit of a blot in our economic history, because clearly Sri Lanka was conquered by India to get its riches. But, lo and behold, they're not able to sustain it. I mean, 12 years after Raja I, the empire in Sri Lanka collapses, the Sinhalese take over. But the trade ties that are built at that time, whether with the Shailendra Empire, which stretches across East Asia, with China, with Sri Lanka, the trade that is facilitated there becomes the bedrock of economic success for 300 years, or maybe perhaps 500 years of Indian history. And there are many lessons there. Of course, we've forgotten all these lessons today, but my friend and mentor S. Gurumurthy makes a very interesting point. He actually compares the idea of caste in India to the idea of Germany, right? In Germany there are all these great trading and manufacturing companies, right? The small manufacturing companies, which actually are the basic backbone of the German industry. So he basically says caste with politics is a horrible thing and that has destroyed India. Caste with economics. So if you look at the Tamil trading communities, every caste or every community there has a particular economic strength and prowess. They're able to develop, trade, manufacture at global levels, at the level of excellence that the globe appreciates. So there are great lessons to be learned there, which I think are fascinating and which we have completely forgotten. Interestingly, and this was very, very interesting to me when I began to read up about this, if you look at the Chola Empire again, the role of temples, today we think of temples only as essentially these dirty religious places. But if you look at that period, each temple as an economic hub where economics happen, which is a source of employment, which is a source of actually Tamil traders interacting, putting in money, creating more jobs. It's an interesting, and I'm not of course suggesting that is replicated today. I don't think we need more temples in India. But I'm just saying that the idea is that you can create structures which work as economic pillars within a society is a very interesting idea. And India knew how to trade with the world. India knew how to build things and develop things. And I completely agree with sir. The idea that India will build everything on its own is a failed idea. It doesn't work. We cannot and we should not try to build everything on our own. Which is why increasingly people believe, and rightfully so, that we should focus on building what we do best. But at least there, I for one, have never entirely, to a degree I see the point, but I've never really agreed 100% on the idea of jugaad, because while I believe jugaad can be an extremely powerful weapon in certain areas and certain businesses, I think the jugaad mentality has also in many ways destroyed the idea that India should make things that are perfect. I mean, think about Germany, right? I mean, we were just talking about Germany. Even today, Germany makes tools. Germany makes manufacturing that even China cannot beat. How do they do it? How do they create some of the greatest and the best quality manufacturing in the world? Because they focus on creating those few things that they do best, but they do it right. Whereas in India, why has India never been able to build a brand? I mean, essentially because in every state, and we see this in company after company, because that's what I do for a living, in company after company, India does not get, we just don't get it right? We get it up to 95% and somehow the last mile connect never happens. It's a bit like Delhi Metro. It's a wonderful system, but once you get off the metro, there is a problem. The last mile connect is always a problem. And that's my problem with jugaad. The last mile connect is always a problem. So, I want to obviously keep some time when we can have a conversation and discuss. But to me, it's a very interesting idea that you build a system that is or you build a system which imagines that it can do something, that it can bring in investment from the world, create systems and processes within India where that investment can be absorbed, and also creates a virtuous cycle within India so that greater savings can happen, more investment can happen, and your banking system expands exponentially to allow the right kind of, because if that last mile connect of banking collapses, you're going to have another Asian crisis in India even as we grow, and we don't want that. We've seen what happens with that. So I'm going to conclude by just saying that we had some great ideas, and I'm going to conclude by giving you an idea and a story and an anecdote which I really love, which per se doesn't have anything with exact trade and economics, but to me it's a great story about how an idea of excellence can be bred into the mind of people. How many of you have heard of King Louis XIV in France? You've heard of King Louis XIV, right? A lot of the great and glory of France, and some of the finest things that France makes, comes from that era. One of the longest serving monarchs of Europe, right? So King Louis XIV, about 10-15 years after he rises to the throne, does a very interesting thing. At that time, the River Seine in Paris is a bit like the Yamuna today, right? It's full of industrial effluent, it's dirty, there are no banks, it's filthy, nobody goes there, people are probably shitting there, so on and so forth, right? In that river, King Louis XIV comes and says that I want Paris to be the best looking, the most glorious city in the world. How do I achieve it? So he says, let us import white swans, right? and we will rebuild the banks of Paris, start cleaning the river, and we will put white swans in the river in sign. Immediately, of course, like it often happens in India, and you will understand this well, the moment an idea is presented, immediately 15 people of his court nobles and at that time the environmentalists and so on and so forth say, oh, this is a terrible idea, how can you do it? How the swans will die there, the river is not clean, look at how all the reasons why we can't do it, and so on and so forth. But King Louis XIV is a confident man, and he's confident that he's going to be able to do this. So he insists, and they begin to put white swans in the river Seine, right? And as the years go by, as more and more swans are put in the river, it creates a unique virtuous cycle, because as more swans are put in the river, a little bit of the river is cleaned, and then it's maintained, and then the banks are built. And King Louis XIV says, I will build the banks of the Seine as the perfect promenade in the whole of Europe, right? And the promenade gets built. And then the Metropolitan Police is given charge of maintaining and ensuring that the swans don't die and the river remains clean. And today, if you go to Paris, as I'm sure all of you know, it's one of the most wonderful things to walk on the banks of the Seine, and you can even today see some white swans. Because even today, I believe, in their statute books, the Metropolitan Police in Paris are in charge of maintaining white swans. Now, why did he do it? He was asked, why did he do it? And he said something really interesting, which I think is the sum total of what we're trying to talk about today. He said, excellence begins in the mind. The French have to believe that they are a great civilization before they can actually become a great civilization. They have to believe that they can create good services that are the best in the world, that are the envy of Europe. They have to believe that they can trade with the world and not only buy the best from the world, but also sell the best of sell to the world the best of Paris, the best of France. And that to me is a very, very powerful idea. So I think whether it's made in India, which unfortunately is, as the professor correctly says, is a failed idea. Hopefully Make in India will not be a failed idea. And there is no, a lot of people think, oh, this is now magically going to happen. It's not going to magically happen. The Prime Minister keeps talking about 100 smart cities because he knows, once you start this cycle, millions of more people are going to move to the cities. Your cities don't have the space to keep those millions of people. But still, at the end of the day, the idea that excellence can be created is an idea that has to begin in the mind. Hopefully, now is the time we'll begin that journey to build that idea in the mind. And hopefully, that to me would be the most powerful idea of India. Thank you very much.
Thank you, moderators, to this guest here. Now the floor is open for Q&A. You can shoot the questions directly to any one of them, and it's open for you now.
Yes, sir, please.
I share my sympathies with Mr. Sengupta.
Thank you, sir.
Born in Sikkim, Gangtok, Aprovashi.
Of course.
Went to Calcutta and I still saw buses in the year 2011, which were made in 1990. So,
They're there today also, sir.
And it's still now.
Why only?
3 years have not gone. I just want to ask you one thing. One strange thing that I saw common in both Calcutta and Gangtok, my hometown, is that people have a lot of innovations with them. You talked about Jugaad.
Sure.
So people have a lot of innovations and all.
Yeah.
I don't understand one thing. If there can be KFC and McDonald's,
sure,
then why can't there be certain brands from India regarding food? Which can be like globalized and like you have King Chow's and all. Then why not something from India? Like we have so many different kind of food items. That is also a way of income.
Oh, absolutely. Not just food items. If you go to London, some of the most expensive restaurants in London and some of the high, packed restaurants in London are all run by Indian chefs. They're Indian restaurants. So absolutely, I completely agree with you. Why not? The reason for that again is, so I'll give you an example of a world I studied with some degree of research. The same question can be, we were just discussing about the Sully caste, right? The same question can be asked of a country which was one of the greatest manufacturers of textiles in the world. Why is it that India has not been able to create one single truly global fabric or clothing brand. Why? Why is there no Indian Hermes? Do you know? I spent 1 year researching the Hermes company in France because we were writing a book, a story in Fortune India. And the point is, do you know that Hermes has never used the word luxury in 150 years of its history? They don't use the word luxury. They believe that when you buy Hermes, you're buying the greatest handwork France can produce. So they don't follow fashion cycles. They don't call it luxury. They're like, this is not luxury. This is the highest money can buy. This is the best money can buy. You want it, you buy it. You don't want it, you don't buy it. Now, the question is, with all of India's prowess in textiles, why is India not being able to build, forget a global brand, even a truly national brand? Why? The answer is that we don't have two things, right? One, we don't have scale. Most Indian businesses, even in high quality businesses in textile and garment manufacturing, including all the Delhi designers you talk about, they're all mom and pop shops. Father left some money, created a little bit. The only example, and again from Calcutta, is Sabyasachi Mukherjee. He's the only great example. But again, Sabyasachi also unfortunately thinks like an Indian. He doesn't want to. If an investment comes to him and says, okay, we'll put in X amount of money for you to build scale, it can't be done because he doesn't want to sell. And the same labor problems that Sir was pointing out will pop up again. To build scale, he will have to build large factories, none of which can be done. Right? So it's not that we don't have the skill sets, we have the skill sets. We've always had the skill sets. Do you know in Gujarat today, there are 5 remaining families in Patan Patola. That's it, 5 remaining families which do it. And they're going to die out. The next generation doesn't want to do it. Because the same Indians who go to, Emporio Mall and buy brown, monogrammed, not even leather bags for 1 lakh rupees, do not want to pay 50,000 rupees for a Patan Patola sari. So we have miserably failed in branding, we have miserably failed in scale, we have miserably failed in labor reforms. We have failed in every way. How will we do it? And that's why you need to believe excellence in your head first. You need to believe that you can do it first before you can actually do it. So you're absolutely right. There ought to be, but there isn't because of all the problems that we were just discussing and Sir was pointing.
If any other questions, sir?
Look, my own interpretation of Made in India and Make in India was that Made in India we should say when it has already happened. When it has not happened, it is a falsehood to say something is made in India. We really don't make much in the world. So we have to invite, and so for inviting people to make in India, we say make in India. That was my personal interpretation, past and future, I mean. So, but as far as this East Asian model is concerned, how the governments actually guide and coach and the business sectors, and that some more light could be shed on that. Like, can India at this moment, let's suppose, I'm sure with this sort of government which we have in place, the laws will all fall into place, the bureaucracy and the state will become more efficient. I mean, the state itself, some liberals say the state is a small state, a night watchman state, etc. But I personally feel from the East Asian model, an active state is also is quite desirable. Only thing it should be really efficient. So I'm assuming that this state will be an efficient state. The laws will all fall into place. The bureaucracy will move faster. But so if that all happens, then what? I mean, like, should we take up any sectors? Should we? I mean, or any sector is good enough? I mean, is there any sequencing? Some more light on all this.
But first, let me comment on one aside on what Mr. Hindol said. I didn't want to bring politics into it, but since you have, let's be fair to the left.
Sure.
What the left did in West Bengal is exactly what the Shiv Sena did in Maharashtra.
Oh, absolutely.
So you couldn't be there in the 2000s. So it's the problem, the extremist ideologies, not the nomenclature left. Any extreme ideology is a problem. Now, second question of why textiles failed. In economics seem to be pretty clear why it happened. It's because the use of technology. Unfortunately, technology has replaced labor extremely well. There's nothing I can do about it. can't remove. Just to take an example, there was a time when the only place where garments, or let me talk about not garment, but the cloths, okay, was made efficiently was in the developing countries. That's not no longer true. Sometimes some Indian sarees are cheaper in Japan than they are in India because of technology. Unfortunately, when you say that people are not willing to pay, are willing to pay 1 lakh for something from some place here, but not 50,000, the question is whose fault is it? Sure. Is it the buyer's fault?
Sure.
If you are convinced that the consumer is an ass, and therefore everything he does is wrong, and that was partly the problem one of the political commentators made these elections. He said, but the problem is that Maharashtra, I don't know why we lost, but Maharashtra's human development indicators are very good. But then other people are idiots. So, we start the proposition that people are idiots, then we run into a lot of issues. Now, let me end on the East Asian thing. I didn't talk about that for a very good reason. Although we talk economics, but economics also comes in a political setting. Try to remember, not one of these East Asian countries, when they began their so-called miracle days, was a democracy. Unfortunately, the only country we have to learn from is the Western countries. And even there, try to remember, even England gave vote to the women only in the 1930s. We are the only country, for right or wrong, I'm not comment on that, we decided that we will be a democracy from day one. Same problem with China. China today, I don't know how many of you have been, go to Beijing, and the pollution in Delhi is like a dream. It's wonderful, lack of pollution in Delhi compared to Beijing. Everyone walking, as you read the news, with gas masks. It's not only TV, it's actually true. Could anyone do it? But India, when we do that, I always say that the democratic way is a slow way. There's nothing you can do about it. Look at the phase of reform in India from 91 as compared to others. We cannot do as quickly. Now let me also end with one last thing, the East Asian crisis. The political aspect which you referred to little obliquely in the Indian context. The basis of social contract in most East Asian countries is Confucianism. Now unfortunately, I will not believe that, Confucianism is very close to the old Indian system of professions. So if you're a good teacher, just plan to be a good teacher. Don't say, I will also be a good businessman. Now, is that acceptable? Not acceptable? I'll leave it to you. Let me end with a joke. The Surendra Sharma, because of teaching community, very well-known poet, very Hasya Kavi, right?
Of course.
And he has this famous joke about these two teachers who are walking past Birla's house. And one teacher tells the other, if I had all his money, I would be as rich as Birla. And the other one says, if I had all his money, I would be richer than Birla. So how do you be richer? Is I'll also do a couple of tuition on the side.
Yeah.
And the question really is, should you not think of doing something which you're not good at? This is partly the problem. Gujarat is not where it is due to any political or economic intervention. You go back to the 1970s, in Gujarat, only the failed people went to the IAS.
That's right.
In JNU, all the failed people are still in JNU. The rest have gone to the IAS. I'm just being, just trying to exaggerate.
Sure.
So Gujarat has had a culture of work. Yeah. It is not important to be in the government. They don't care about it. Bombay is where it is today precisely for the same reason. Now, what I'm saying is, for a democratic country like India, it's better to look at countries like the US, which have followed democracy from day one, not for political reasons, but for economic reasons. Try to understand, we always learn the wrong things from the Americans because of political issue, about the multinationals and their nuclear thing. But if you look at the functioning, they have systemic systems. Take the recent case, the famous case of the riots for a few days, Ferguson, because of all white police in an all black people who shot dead a black person. Within 1 week, they sorted out. And we are still trying to sort out our Hindu versus Muslims, upper caste versus lower caste issues 30 years after we did it. Within 1 week, because the systemic system, the systems that are there, here everything is very individual dependent. Unless we move from individual dependence to system dependence, you will never be able to do any of these things. So, whereas it is true that we have a Prime Minister who speaks a little more than the previous one does and is a little more proactive, can he do it by himself? That's where I agree with Mr. Sengupta, right? That it is this change in mind. You've got to stop thinking thinking that anyone who makes money must be a thief.
Yeah.
You know, unless you start with that thinking, I think all these things will be a waste of time. Thank you.
I just want to add one small thing here. First, I mean, I completely agree with you, sir, that this idea that, it is the consumer's fault that they are paying for, say, Louis Vuitton and not Patola sarees is entirely wrong. The consumer is paying for whatever is being sold the right way or being marketed the right way to the consumer. And the quality, and the consumer is, the consumer is finally choosing what is most life appropriate to them, which they can use and they can, get the right quality and the right value and so on and so forth. So the fault entirely lies with the people who are producing and whether they can market it and so on and so forth. I completely agree with you. Also, I do, may I say this, take off from whatever sir just said right at the end. I mean, look, we're at JNU today. I studied at MCRC in Jamia. And, we used to joke there that every single person of I always said I'm going to come out and, work for a television channel and for a company and so on and so forth. But most of my classmates used to say they will all go to the villages and work for the poor. They all came out of MCRC and went straight to Ashtak. So, the problem is that we build these myths in our head about what we want to do and what we ought to be doing. We have romanticized, Calcutta, why is Calcutta where it is? The fault lies in that society, unfortunately, to a great extent. It's not that there is no intelligence in that society. It's not like there is no innovation in the society. There is intelligence, there is innovation. But there is this culture of romanticizing poverty, that I am good and virtuous because I am poor. So my virtue lies in poverty, which is extremely detrimental. And this is not to say that every rich person is, honest. Of course not. India is full of the worst kind of crony capitalists and crooks. There is no doubt about that. But for that we need, as sir was saying, systems and processes, laws which are fair and honest. If the law catches you, whether you're rich or poor, if you're a crook and the law catches you, it should do justice. But we have different laws for the rich and different laws for the poor. But at the same time, to make a virtue out of being poor, कि मुझे मैं गरीब हूँ, मैं गरीब था, मैं गरीब हूँ और आगे चल के भी मैं गरीब रहूँगा. This is ridiculous. It's become a burden on our civilization and our soul. We have to stop thinking this.
Let me just say one thing, since we are in JNU, one thing that tells the students, this problem of getting everything for free.
Yeah.
I'll give a small example. Some of you may be aware that we have a number of faculty who play badminton in the mornings at Teflons. And I had one day a student who walked in, an old friend who badminton player, who said, "Sir, dekho haal kya hai?" I said, "What do you pay for it?" We don't even pay for the shuttles which you get free from the sports department. So what you see is what you pay for is what you get. So you have to start thinking in terms of paying for services. So there is no other way. JNU is temporarily alive financially, but after 4-5 years, we are again dead financially. And part of the reason why you probably find some more money arriving from student travel, etc., because of a temporary grant, a one-time thing we got from the ministry. I don't think it's going to happen. I'm going to end quickly with the East Asian thing, one of the economic issues. Go back to the history of East Asian countries. Look at where they spend on education. They spend all their money on primary and secondary education, not on higher education. Where we are starting on the other side. Reservation, where should start first the government, then education. And now, school. What use is reservation in university? What does it do? Can I do anything to change thinking of people in 2 years, a year, 3 years? We always start the wrong way. Look at any country which has had a computerized education. They've always begun from schools. USA after the civil rights in the 1960s. East Asia, of course, they didn't have the problems. But it always has been at the lower level, never at the start. So you have private sector education which is not changing. And where there's a lot of opposition, still people are fighting cases, should there be reservation? I don't understand. I think the first place there should be reservation schools. There should be no thinking about it. The Right to Education Act should have come in 1989 and not the other stuff. And again, as I said, that's because politicians send their children to private schools, not universities. And that is why you find that reservation is a big thing at the government and higher sector and not in the lower sector.
By the way, sir was saying, Shiv Sena, this is an interesting point. I used to live in Bombay for 5 years. You know, for all the, and this is classic, this happened in Calcutta also, we saw this happen, that politicians would make a virtue out of regional languages. That it's just Shiv Sena in Maharashtra would say Marathi, but all the children of the Shiv Sena family, you know, the Thakres, they all went to English medium schools. And they still do. In Calcutta, all the children of the great communist leaders would happily go to Le Martiniere and St. Xavier's, and then happily, taking the right kind of grants and scholarships, would happily escape to America, whereas 60% of the population had to suffer in Bengali medium schools and get no jobs. So, I mean, you know, this kind of hypocrisy, time has come.
You talk about the failure of the nationalist model in Malaysia. So, but there is another nationalist model which is equally very successful, which has got one of the highest brand records. That's the Swiss model, and they are equally manufacture very small things like watches, knives, with their national flags on it. So, how did the Swiss model, a landlocked country, work successfully?
No. You are getting confused by a brand of a country and making everything in the country. Two different things. There's nothing made in Switzerland. Switzerland is a place little bigger than Delhi. About 2-3 sizes. Everything made in Switzerland is made by a multinational company. They are not Swiss. Nestle is Nestle a Swiss company? See, where you are legally originating does not mean you're a Swiss company. I'm saying get confused, don't get getting confused by made in India and made by things only used in India. The two issues. That's the point I was making. I will tell you what will be the next failure of the made in the country thing. It will be the nano car. You know, this is something which is trying to replace scooters, or while in 10 years it will be history. I can take it from you. I should still be here in 5 years from now, at least. We can talk about 5 years from now, it will be history.
No, and also you spoke about Swiss manufacturing in luxury watches, right? I mean, you know, Swatch, I know, a company I know well, which is the biggest and the giant of luxury watchmaking in the world. It owns most of the big brands. What does Swatch, the biggest money that Swatch makes comes from its quote-unquote mass lines, and they are not made in Switzerland. They are made from, as the same product, manufactured in various parts of the world, put together in Switzerland. The highest end, their highest, most expensive brands are made in Switzerland. So the parts are actually, but that's really, really tiny. I mean, if you put that entire industry with Patek Philippe, some brands from Swatch, whatever, you could put all of them in the JNU campus. It's that small. It's just that they're able to make and brand things at a level that, a Patek Philippe watch costs $50,000 and $60,000 and $100,000. That's the great success. That the Japanese couldn't beat them, the Chinese cannot beat them now, and whatever. That's a separate thing, but that's a very tiny thing. Even the French and Italian luxury brands, including Hermes and Gucci and whatever, they all, their great pride is made in Italy and made in France. But how big is that? How many people do they employ? Very, very small numbers. Extremely small numbers. A country cannot run on the basis of, 10 factories with 1,000 people each. That cannot be the manufacturing base of a country.
Is it healthy to have a single company in various sectors? Like they are in road, infrastructure, food, in service sector. The problem with Indian economy is that you find a single company which is all over the sectors.
Conglomerates, basically.
You find it in various sectors.
Well, I don't know, it's a difficult question to answer. Question I would ask an economist, why is there a single company? Is there a single company because they are the only ones who have money, or is it because they are using, crony capitalism? I don't know. But we have competition laws in place, and you are perfectly at liberty to go to the competition commission and complain. Like you've seen some complaints in the case of housing have taken place. I don't know if I can answer that. What should I do? Should I tell them, don't bring it up? It's also not wrong. The Americans did that in telephone, but I don't know if our market is large enough to sustain as many people as we think it is. And secondly, my problem with all this foreign investment discussions always talks about Europe and USA. But there are a whole lot of multinationals in East Asia. There are Japanese, South Korea. South Korea, 2 companies run the whole country. Samsung and LG. They run department stores also. They run these convenience stores also. They also make cars now. So I don't know if the problem is with the ownership or if the problem is of the competitive environment. I don't know which is the one. I don't know.
I just want to ask about what can be the possible social implication of just making India and new urbanization and industrialization. As people like Chandbhan Prasad have been saying, that to break down the caste system, you have to pull the people out of the agrarian sector into a modern industrial society. So how do you see this dynamic panning out in the coming few decades?
No, I'm really glad you brought up Chandrabhan Prasad. I'm a great admirer of Chandrabhan Prasad, and I think he does some excellent work. I spend a lot of time writing a new book which has a large chapter on enterprise among Dalit, what is commonly called Dalit entrepreneurship. So I spoke to a whole bunch of people. It's a very interesting paradigm. Chandrabhan Prasad has this wonderful line which says, "Pizza delivery ka koi jaat nahi hota." That when a pizza delivery guy comes to you, you don't ask what is his caste that when you accept food from his hands. So I think he has a very, very important and powerful point. So Chandrabhan Prasad told me this wonderful story which I must mention. So Chandrabhan Prasad is in Azamgarh, which is the area he comes from, and he of course grew up there and he knows the area well and whatever. And there is this upper caste, zamindar. So वहाँ पे क्या होता था? If you all don't mind me breaking into Hindi, वहाँ पे क्या होता था कि पहले मुर्गियाँ जो थी वो सिर्फ जमींदारों के पास होती थी. तो जब वो खेत में जो दलित काम करता था, वो जब आता था, उसके घर पे कोई त्योहार हो गया, whatever, he used to come to the landlord and say, आप साहब मुझे एक मुर्गी दे दीजिए, मैं जरा घर पे आज कुछ है बना लूँगा. तो वो उनको the scraggliest beast used to be given to the farm labor, So Chandrabhan Prasad says, after all this migration started happening and people used to come to the city and make money and work, he used to say a wonderful story was told to me by one of the same guys. He said, पहले तो वो आते थे, ले जाते थे हमसे. अभी क्या है, अब तो शहर चले गए हैं. अब शहर से आते हैं, मोटर बाइक भी आ गई उनके पास, डिश भी लग गया घर पे. आजकल तो हमारे सामने से मोटर बाइक पकड़ के, मुर्गी पकड़ के फरफराते हुए चले जाते हैं. So Chandrabhan Prasad says that in that incident, in that anecdote, that imagery of the ex-farm laborer, ex-Dalit farm laborer on a motorbike bought from city-bred money or city-acquired or city sort of earned money, holding a fat chicken and passing by the bhumiyar, whatever, landlord, on a motorbike, breaks caste notions more than anything ever can. He says that is the final blow to caste. Once that happens, nothing can change back. It will never be the same again. You can do whatever you feel like, it can't be the same again. And I'm not for a moment suggesting that this is true in every case, not at all. I mean, even as I sit here today, one day ago we have heard about this horrible incident of this 15-year-old Dalit boy who's been burned to death because his goat crossed him. Of course not. I mean, in a large and diverse country like ours, I'm sure this doesn't work everywhere. But I'm only saying that we also should consider this as one more powerful tool. We should not dismiss economics as a powerful tool to break caste, because clearly research after research is showing that economics is an equally powerful tool to break caste.
I'll give the privilege of the last question, and this is for Prof Pant. Sir, keeping this in mind, this what is the proposal is Make in India and all this. Do you see the kind of the reforms that we are talking? We have the structural that capacity in place to sustain that what we are supposed to do in Make in India, and how important is the domestic investment is concerned? Because that is the one thing which we evaluate when we concern the China. One of the key things was the growth that we saw in China was the large domestic investment, if I'm correct. And the second is when we do massive infrastructure, that is the key, is irrespective of other sectors, that is virtuous cycle, including the banking and others. How it is gonna tackle the fiscal deficit. When you do massive infrastructure, then the fiscal deficit may go further. And is there any constraint? How really you upbeat about? Do you view that? How it's gonna unfold?
Okay, your first question was regarding
The domestic investment.
Well, of course, no country has ever survived only for investment, not large countries. Try to understand today, for all the people talk about it, foreign investment even at today's level is less than 1%, maybe 1.5% of GDP. So 1.5% GDP can't drive investment. Investment is 32% GDP. Certainly domestic investment. Question is, how does it happen on its own? So there's no question about that. It has to be domestic investment. Second thing is regarding the deficit. Now, see, the question is this. We tend to read too much of economics, which is largely based on what is called full employment economics. I'm not too certain, the reason why the RBI worries about the fiscal deficit is not because it's going to be inflationary, in a situation of unemployment need not be inflationary, but because the increase in money supply leads to fall in interest rate, then government starts borrowing too much. Their problem is the government. Their problem is fiscal deficit is not necessarily inflationary, as long as we keep the government away from borrowing too much. That's the problem which the RBI happens with. So I don't think that is the issue. And try to understand the other part of infrastructure, again, from people from Northeast and smaller towns appreciate this. Infrastructure is always thought of as something which happens once facilities develop. In India, there's what we call supply side infrastructure. For example, establish a road. The amount of shops and small things that build up along the road, look at anything, actually sustain the economies. They do create a lot of jobs and keep people off the road. So I think that these benefits, I don't think it's necessarily inflationary. Of course, they have been financially so far with private sector. But only thing is the Land Acquisition Act and all these things, without it gets into too many complications. You have to sort out the Land Acquisition Act. But I don't think so. I don't think creating infrastructure inflationary. Otherwise, most of the developed countries should have very high inflation rate. So I don't think so.
I just have one small thing to add on infrastructure. It's a very interesting point. A very dear friend of mine has just created this wonderful company called Crop Connect, and they are basically working to connect farm. It's a farm to fork model. Connect agriculture to markets. They're doing a very interesting thing. They're working in Arunachal Pradesh because they realized that very nice quality kiwis are grown in Arunachal Pradesh. But you cannot get in so-called mainland India because the infrastructure is so horrible. Do you know a lot of the kiwis we eat in Delhi are actually brought from New Zealand? It is cheaper to bring New Zealand kiwis to Delhi than bring kiwis from Arunachal Pradesh to Delhi.
That's true all over Northeast.
I mean, so, and they travel to Arunachal Pradesh and they say that when we gaze on the other side, so to speak, what China has built there, it's a marvel. I mean, it's if today, God forbid, if today there is military conflict, we'll get wiped out. I mean, it'll be 62 all over again. So, I don't think we're at a level where we have to start worrying about too much infrastructure. We are so below the curve at the moment that at least wo base level pe aate bahut, there's a lot of time to go.
We have come to the conclusion now, this end of the discussion, and I must thank on the behalf of India First and the JNU students. It's a privilege, sir, to have you